Hi, I want to welcome you back to the second part of my New Deal lecture. My name is Bill Van Bunschoten, and I'm giving this lecture from Sanctuary Hill in Mid City, Los Angeles. I wanted to start with this slide. It's public work projects abounded. Remember, I talked about how the New Deal, the first New Deal, had two aims. One was recovery, and the other one was relief. The relief came in various forms. One was, for instance, the insuring of people's savings in banks. It was the issuing of low interest loans from the government in order to allow people to buy homes. Recovery was the NIRA, an attempt to sort of jumpstart industry, to give them low interest loans as well, and to coordinate with other businesses to emphasize cooperation rather than competition. So we see the New Deal under full sail, as it were, taking going forth. Public works played a critical role in it, and long after the New Deal was a memory in the minds of many people. What the New Deal created is still very much with us. This is a good example of it. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a system of 11 dams along the Tennessee, mostly the Tennessee River. Those dams were in a depressed area of the country. As you can see, it bordered several states: Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, North and South Carolina. And the goal was to create dams that would not only employ millions of people, again, in an area that was depressed, but also create electricity for that area. And in many cases, electrify regions that had never seen electricity before, had never had it. So the Tennessee Valley Authority was important. It was a part, again, of a large public works program. The assumption behind it was get the young and the rebellious element out of the cities and keep them occupied. If they were left idle, they might become socialists, they might become communists, they might think of ways, for instance, of overturning, upending the government. Another requirement, though, of public works was not only to tap into this labor source, but also to avoid direct poor relief. America wanted to remain capitalist. FDR was a capitalist at heart. He wasn't going to turn the United States into the Soviet Union. So it was important to give relief, but to extract labor as well, something in return, and something that would be long lasting. And in this case, infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is that sort of underlying foundation of bridges, dams, highways, roads that allow business to grow of itself and allow people to communicate and to keep down jobs. Anyway, public works would keep the jobless rate low, and it would create important infrastructure. And one of the public works administrations that came out of the New Deal was the Civil Works Administration, but there were many others. Civil works would be, again, just what I said, dams, for instance. It would be highways, viaducts, subways. The PWA was also another administration, public works administration. It operated or tended to operate on a more local level. And then the master project, and I say master because it was the keystone of the public works program, and it was an achievement that FDR was very proud of. Even a few days before he died, he was talking about the TVA and how he wanted to create new TVAs in other parts of the country because it had been so effective in achieving its aims. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, and this is where the federal government, in a sense, gets in on the electricity business. And so the public works went forward. This photo attests to that. You see a whole long line of men with wheelbarrows full of dirt working on one of these projects. Scenes like this were occurring all over the country. These were hopeful signs. These were not soup lines, right? That was something new. These were not bread lines. These were people who were doing a hard day's work and improving the country and improving their own personal situations. That's relief. So the first New Deal, relief through public works. These are further images of the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is the Big Ridge Dam in the upper left there, being constructed. On the right, you see a close-up of that construction. It employed 35,000 men. The effects of the public works programs could be seen all over the country. I recently went to Franklin Canyon Park, and I was walking there and I came upon the dam, and there's a sort of concrete barrier near the dam, and there was a plaque set in it. And that plaque looked like this: built by United States Work Project Administration. The Work Project Administration, a key administration under the New Deal, the first and second New Deals for that matter. They built this bridge, this dam. The dam created the Franklin Canyon Lake. And that lake is something you can visit if you're in Los Angeles. It's off of Sunset. It's near Coldwater Canyon. It's a beautiful area. Cattails, ducks, turtles. People from Beverly Hills and the surrounding area come with their families on a weekday and have a wonderful time. And again, these are sort of a permanent or a physical legacy of the New Deal. And many of these bridges, dams, aqueducts, etc., grace Southern California. This is a map showing again where that dam was. It's sort of in the middle here, Silver Lake. It's just under the upper Los Angeles River tidal, if you look. I don't know if you can see my pointer. In any case, it gives you an idea, too, of other dams, other reservoirs, and some paid for by the New Deal, some occurring before the New Deal. But the New Deal programs were essential to building up the infrastructure in Southern California. The Blue Eagle, the National Recovery Administration, helped small businesses with loans, with guidance, maintenance. It insured loans. And signs like this, the spread Blue Eagle, for instance, could be seen all over America in small towns, in big towns, wherever you went. And it was good advertising for the New Deal. Not that they needed it. I mean, they were doing some good work on the ground. Businesses were being saved year after year because of this program. A huge influx of cash from the federal government, again, because of that redefinition of what the relationship should be between the federal government and the citizenry. Now, all of this sounds very hopeful, and it was. There were a lot of great achievements in those first couple of years of the New Deal up till 1935, but not everyone was pleased. And you should know that there were critics of the New Deal. Of course, there are always critics, right? But FDR was taking rather radical steps. And so his critics were also very critical of some of these unprecedented steps, Hoover being, of course, one of the key ones. The Supreme Court stepped in and found that the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act were unconstitutional and shot them down. FDR was thrown for a loop, but being FDR, you'll see by the second New Deal, he improvised other programs that, in a sense, took the place of those that were abolished. There was no significant economic recovery in spite of all of this frantic activity in the first 2 years of the New Deal. Some people would say, well, that proves that the New Deal was ineffective. Other people will say, well, at least there was no revolution. Now, if that seems alarmist or an exaggeration, you should know that at the time, that wasn't so much an exaggeration. There were people who seriously feared for the existence, the continued existence of the United States. They feared a communist takeover, the same that had been seen in the Soviet Union. They feared communist labor unions that were coming in and unionizing one industry after another. So that fear was real. There was any number of grassroots revolts. One of them, for instance, occurred at the Ford plants. The United Auto Workers Union under John Lewis struck in 1934. It was one of the largest strikes in American history, 20,000 workers. At one point, 35,000 workers went out on strike. Another labor organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, formed and began to organize labor very aggressively. There was a man in California who was running for the governorship, a former muckraker. His name was Upton Sinclair. You might have heard of him when we talked about muckrakers in the progressive period, about 1900. Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle, which is a critique of the meatpacking industry in the United States. Anyway, Upton Sinclair had written even more novels since that time, and faced with the crisis that was the Great Depression, ran for the governorship in California in 1933-34. He proposed a program called EPIC, End Poverty in California, which proposed an old age insurance scheme and many other what many considered to be socialistic measures. Anyway, many thought that if Upton Sinclair was successful in California, it would spread to the rest of the country, and that would shoot down the New Deal and cause a certain amount of havoc. That didn't happen, of course. Upton Sinclair eventually lost the governorship, but no one knew that, right? History is hindsight is 2020. There were other critics of the New Deal. Unions were going out on strike. There was still upheaval throughout the economy. There were people who came forward, very charismatic individuals, who came forward with new ideas. One of them was Hoover. Hoover remained a public figure. He spoke out against what he considered to be communism under FDR. The American Freedom League was created, and it again seconded Hoover, believed that the New Deal was destroying American individualism and American freedoms and needed to be stopped. Some anti union Democrats in the South opposed the pro unionism of the New Deal. And so we begin to see a split in the Democratic Party. It seemed slight at first in the 1930s. We'll see that by the 1940s and particularly by the 50s, a different branch of the Democratic Party goes, in a sense, rogue. More of that later. There were particular figures who were important. Father Charles Coughlin was a priest. You see him there in the middle photograph, standing in front of the microphone, his hand raised. Father Coughlin was a Catholic priest out of Detroit. He was a radio preacher. He was very, very popular. And as the as the Great Depression deepened, his popularity grew. He was an advocate of the New Deal at first, but then when he realized that FDR wasn't going to nationalize the banks and he wasn't going to issue silver currency, he began to speak out. And so FDR constantly kept an eye on him. There were other figures who were just as powerful, if not more so. Huey Long was a political rival. He starts out as a lawyer in Louisiana. He gathers around him a circle of very loyal people who eventually win him the governorship there. And in the face again of the Great Depression and the problems it created, he puts forward the Share Our Wealth program, where he claimed that every man could be a king. And again, like Upton Sinclair, he proposed an age-old pension plan for people. He proposed also that the poor should receive a certain fixed amount of cash. He put conditions on that amount, but nevertheless, it was very, very successful. Imagine it, millions of people on the unemployment rolls and a man talking to them about money, guaranteed money per month that would keep them afloat. Anyway, his popularity grew. He was also very charismatic. His picture is on the upper right, his hands spread out in his very stylish suit there. And then finally, Francis Townsend. Townsend proposed an old age revolving pension plan. Again, notice this theme again and again of pensions. Townsend was proposed that people should receive every month $200, and they would receive it so long as they spent every last dollar of it before the next month. And the goal, of course, was not only to keep people solvent, to put food in their mouths, to help them pay their mortgages, but also to get money into the capitalist machine, right? Because the more people spent, the more they consumed, the more had to be produced. It would get the factories online again. Everyone would be happy. The assembly lines would start to move. People would have jobs. That was the idea, to prime the pump, as it was called. Anyway, these were the critics. In the face of these criticisms, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the very shrewd Franklin Delano Roosevelt, began to strike back. And one of the ways he did it was by adopting some of the measures proposed by his enemies. All right, we're back. I apologize for that interruption. The Second New Deal was, again, as I said, a reply to these critics, partly by adopting some of their measures. This is a quote by Roosevelt, and it tells you a little bit about his state of mind when he was running for re-election in 1835. He said, "Men are not prisoners of fate, but only prisoners of their own minds." And again, this was sort of this continued attempt to raise the spirits of the country, to help them see that they had nothing to fear but fear itself. He said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little," which to my mind sounds a lot like Kennedy. And of course, Kennedy would in many ways model himself upon Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he became president in 1961. And then finally, the last quote: "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." Franklin Roosevelt, the experimenter, the man who was fearless in junking measures that didn't work and employing new ones. The Second New Deal was an attempt to try new things. He's up for re-election, as I said, in November of 1935. He would win that election in a landslide. No one knew that at the time. He began to shift now, under the New Deal, his aims. Recovery and relief would always be important, but now he was going to include economic security as well, and reform, long-term reform of the economy. So, stronger medicine. As I said, the economic numbers were not hopeful. People's spirits were lifted. They were seeing progress, but the progress wasn't being translated into actual facts. Job growth wasn't much. Production hadn't gone up much. It was still unpredictable, still fragile. So, the Second New Deal, we're going to hit just the high points. The key, if you remember anything about the Second New Deal, remember the Social Security Act of 1935. It actually is passed in 1937, I believe. But it was a key part in sort of the long-term reform of the American economy, because what it did was it created a baseline. It created a safety net for people, those older in years, senior citizens. It created supplementary income to them when they reached 65. It also applied to other groups, but for the most part, it was for, again, those who were elderly. The Works Progress Administration, remember that image I showed you of the plaque at Franklin Canyon Park? It was created by or under the Works Progress Administration. It replaces the Public Works Administration, which had been shut down by the Supreme Court. Oh, sorry, my cat just walked on the keyboard. The REA was another important part of the New Deal, Rural Electrification Agency, that's connected, of course, with the TVA and its 11 dams. Other dams began to be planned and put in place, especially in the Northwest. The Wagner Act, in a big way, the Second New Deal attempts to institutionalize collective bargaining for labor. In other words, the right of labor to represent workers as a group. That had not been recognized by the government before. So the Wagner Act did that. So the federal government oversaw union elections, made sure that they were fair and honest. They put an end to blackballing or the firing of union leaders. And in many ways, they brought labor fully into the government. And finally, the U.S. Housing Act. We know that earlier, under the earlier measure in the New Deal, low interest mortgages had been offered. The U.S. Housing Act expanded this program. Here's an image of FDR on the right, very happily signing the Social Security bill. The image on the top is meant to remind you that all of these measures were very important, far-reaching, some of them, but that the problem remained. Behold what labor can do. The Grand Coulee Dam was one of those public works programs. It was in Washington State. Here's an aerial photo of the Grand Coulee Dam. An amazing achievement. Even today, it looks very modern. And it showed you, again, the power of the federal government, its power, its ability to organize vast numbers of people, to raise vast amounts of money, and to bring about something that would benefit the public for those who lived in the entire region and therefore the country itself, really. So the Grand Coulee Dam was started under the Second New Deal. Here's a poster for the Works Progress administration. As I said, it was a great period for posters. Work Pays America. It shows sort of the union of the farmer on the left and the factory hand on the right in overalls, and between them, a grain of wheat, a symbol of hope, literally. In Latin, the word for hope goes back to the idea of prosperity. In any case, the Work Progress Administration, FDR attacked not only through legislation, but he attacked the public airwaves. In a sense, he wanted again to reassure Americans. He was the first president not to use radio, but to use it effectively, to really make it a part of, or one of the tools that he had that he could draw upon. In many ways, similar to perhaps what President Trump is doing with Twitter. Again, using sort of a new technological marvel in order to get his message out. And with the radio, just as Trump does with Twitter, FDR went directly to the people. They weren't getting him watered down or translated or interpreted or mediated. You heard the president. And so FDR was elected after 1935, takes the oath of office again in 1936, and continues to make what were called fireside chats in order to alert Americans to what was happening, the progress that was made, what still needed to be done. And all of this created a sense of unity among the American public, that the president was looking out for them. Here's a picture, a promotional shot of a young girl listening to a rather large radio. So the radio was important in selling the New Deal. And another tool he used, of course, was press conferences. Communicating hope. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, was perhaps the first modern first lady. Here she is with Marian Anderson, the singer. She invented, as I said, the concept of the first lady that we see it today, someone who, for instance, undertakes an important initiative. In the case of, for instance, Michelle Obama, she promoted healthy eating, right, in Grill Garden in the White House. In a way, she was following in the steps of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a progressive. She was part, of course, of the Oyster Bay Roosevelt family. She was a suffragist. She fought for women's rights. She married FDR, and instead of giving up her political aspirations, in a sense, pursued them, but pursued them discreetly. Her marriage with FDR was known to be, let us say, troubled. Or maybe a better way is that they had agreed more or less that their marriage was a marriage of convenience. Each of them pursued their own affairs. Each of them pursued their own independence. They had what maybe strikes people today as a very modern relationship. It did not please other people. In any case, it was what it was. And again, we don't know all of the facts. In any case, their marriage was difficult at times. They eventually reached sort of an accommodation with each other. Eleanor Roosevelt, as First Lady, pursued many different measures, many different programs. She was behind civil rights, women's rights, social reforms, including the Social Security Act of 1935. When Marian Anderson was not allowed to sing at one venue because of the color of her skin, Eleanor Roosevelt made sure that she sang, I believe, in front of the Jefferson Memorial, to show her solidarity. And she promoted civil rights in a way that FDR didn't, or didn't feel he could. In any case, she did. And so after FDR dies, she, in a sense, comes into her own, and she's still a very important figure, still very much a power in the Democratic Party. All right, it's 1938. Roosevelt has been reelected for a second term. The Roosevelt recession hits, at precisely the moment when it seemed as if all of these various programs I've talked about were finally bearing fruit. Why was that? FDR had reduced by 1937 federal spending because of hopeful signs he had seen in the financial data. Um, Jobs had grown, had increased. There were more businesses afoot. There was more investment in the economy. And so it seemed as if the economy perhaps had righted itself or was on the way of doing so. And therefore, FDR sort of pulled back a little bit on the federal funds. Unfortunately, the economy almost immediately tanked. Again, unemployment hit 14% in 1937. Within a year, it had reached 20%. Only in 1938 did FDR, therefore, become what is called a true Keynesian. And what does that mean? Well, when we come back for the second part, or rather the third part, excuse me, of this lecture on the New Deal, we'll talk a little bit about Keynesianism, this economic philosophy, and we'll also talk about how the New Deal wraps up and some of its achievements. All right, so I will see you then.